Thank you so much, and welcome to this episode of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, where we discuss ideas of democracies and more. Today we are joined by Dr. Thabang Manyike, who is a founder of the Black Intellectual Praxis. He's a teacher, he's a theorist, and he's an anti-colonial scholar. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Samukelo. Thank you so much. Let's do this finally.
Yeah, it's so good to finally have you here. I think first, you recently graduated with your PhD, so let me start there. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And it's been long coming, so it's good that you finally done with it.
Yeah, not graduated, but finally completed. I think the graduation is coming up in December. But yeah, as you're saying, it's been a long journey. You know, PhDs are usually, 3 to 5 years. Yeah. Mine took about, 8 years or something like that, so it's been a long journey.
This was in political studies.
Political studies. At some point I was registered in the African Literature Department.
Okay.
That was, during the 2015-16 FISMAS 4. Yeah. And then I think about 3 years ago, came back to political studies department.
Yeah, and what was your focus? What was the...
My focus, I've always, I think since my master's, I've been preoccupied with what it means to be Black, African and Muslim in South Africa particularly. Why? Because usually when we think about Islam, and this is unique to Southern Africa, or to South Africa specifically. Usually when we think about Islam, we usually think of the Indian and Malay communities. We never seem to think of, indigenous Black Africans from South Africa, as Muslims. So my focus was trying to reconcile or trying to understand what it means to be Black and a Muslim. Of course, I was doing this at one hand for the young Muslim community, the young Black Muslim community, which has been in existence since, the 16th century, but particularly in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And what I want, because I'm in politics, I've always been interested in anti-colonial thought, I'm always, always thinking about how we can innovate, think differently about the world that we are living in, think differently about how we can change the world we are living in. And so I think those two experiences, being Black and being Muslim, sort of gave me a framework on how we can, start thinking different about pedagogy, how we can think different about epistemology, we can think different about politics, what does political theory look like, reflected by Black African Muslim, and so I call my sort of theoretical innovation and method, Black Islamic praxis, which is, supposed to, inform us into how we think of, in how Black people, Black Africans think about Islam and Blackness in this world, of course, confronted by Western imperialism or Western dominated education, how do we then think about that? And of course, and not to be long, but I'm also thinking about this in relation to Islam in the continent. Islam in the continent has a long history and a long trajectory. So what I'm trying to do is to also center African Muslims into the narrative of what it means to be Muslim, in the world. Because mostly when we think about then the broader sort of Islamic identity, we usually, think of the Middle East, think of India, think of Arabs, Mediterranean Muslims, so, my approach now was to, think very carefully about and center African Muslims in, the study of knowledge production.
Yeah, I'm so glad that I think your research was on something really I think something that has not really been tackled much, particularly in more popular thought. The Islamic communities even around the continent. They exist within the outside folds sometimes of democratic movements, within particularly the Black Islamic communities.
Sure.
And so I think the discussion today, I want us to kind of like tie it around the Black intellectual thought and democracy.
Sure.
And we can move from Fanon to Biko, from Mbeki to Stuart Hall, and see how we can think about or rethink about democracy. So here I want to begin maybe by the idea that the proliferation of the very word democracy.
Sure.
That sometimes it comes across as a very as useless to think with sometimes, because of being pulled all around, which sometimes render it useless and meaningless to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Is it still a useful concept to think with, particularly when we are trying to imagine a new world?
I've never taken seriously the idea of a democracy. The simple reason will be the sort of current conditions in post-apartheid South Africa, the conditions that Black people find themselves in, the conditions that we usually think of the anti-colonial, anti-apartheid struggle, as having inaugurated this moment, where freedom will reign, where economic equality, will be sort of distributed amongst, all, Black people, or, citizens, as they say, from the ANC point of view. But I think what we have encountered then is something that is different from the concept. And then, it sort of makes me to be suspicious about the concept itself. What is democracy? What are its origins? As a student of political theory, of course, I will tell you that the origins of democracy itself, dates back to the ancient Greeks. But why is it that we always refer to the ancient Greeks, the ancient city-states, Greek city-states? It's because, during the 18th century in Europe, there was an intellectual movement called the Enlightenment period, and this is a movement that is, that is birthed by another movement that is started in the 16th century called the Renaissance. Then the Renaissance is when Europeans are now starting to, sort of go back to the classics, whether it's in knowledge production or in organizing societies. And then in the 18th century, this idea finds so much credence. And of course, this is coupled by, or this is pushed so much by the French Revolution, which is, today considered, the revolution of democracy, isn't it? You know? So it's, if we take seriously those origins and how then, the concept of democracy is then spread throughout the world. And for us, of course, we encounter these concepts, these practices, through colonialism, and in South Africa, particularly settler colonialism. And of course, if you are in South Africa, you definitely know that during the British Union, it was called a democratic dispensation.
Yeah.
Even in 1948, when the fascists and sort of apartheid settler colonials started beginning, it was called a democratic state. It was a democratic state. And we talk about post 1994. It is a democratic state. So how then do you understand the concept during those three very different periods, and epochs? So for me, hence I'm saying that the concept is a bit murky and is very shallow in how it wants to address the idea of a people's government, people, ruled by the masses, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't capture that in essence and in practicality. But if you're talking about, living in a society where, people have, freedom of thought, freedom of movement, where individuals can sort of achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve without any imposition, then democracy is not the only concept and way that can capture those sort of freedoms. I mean, most of the time also when we talk about democracy, especially in the continent, we are referring to, free elections. We are referring to, things such as the separation of powers, the legislature, executive, judiciary, independent. And those ideas are usually have been for a very long time tied to the colonial masters as well. Their control of the continent in one way or the other, whether it's practically in politics or, practically with the economy, So, our sense of democracy has always been controlled from, from outside, I would say, I would argue. Of course, I mean, we can say, no, we have our own systems of thought, our own systems of organizing our communities, but they are not democratic in that sense. They are democratic, in the sense that we would, explain them in the way we would practice them, So I think there's always been this disjuncture in the continent in how we, want to, we try to understand the concept of democracy.
Yeah.
And most of the time we know if a leader has been in power for 8 years or 20 years, that is anti-democratic, We can't say, you talk about, places such as China, that's anti-democratic, Russia is anti-democratic, all of those places, Iran, those who are outside of the Western sort of knowledge power, they are considered anti-democratic, So I think it's important for us to really unpack what the concept has meant for us, rather than accepting the impositions of what it means to be democratic.
Yeah. Does this make democracy an empty signifier then, in a sense that an empty signifier that has no transhistorical or universality in it. And here, I don't know, I'm thinking with Stuart Hall, who also draws from Laclau in thinking around democracy as constantly being in the horizon, which means its very nature is constantly this promise of a new, this promise of something else, which I think is tied to the idea of freedom also, which is like constantly in the on the horizon. But the question here that I would pose to you, does this make democracy an empty signifier?
Democracy is an empty signifier. And I'm trying to think of how this French theorist was thinking about it. But I mean, we can say what we are really chasing when we're talking about democracy is the idea of freedom, the idea of an all-encompassing, conception of freedom, that is not limited, Hence, you would find, democracy has always been associated with liberalism, the ideology of liberalism. And the idea of liberal democracy, we know, even today, that, it's sort of it can survive outside of the relationship with capital.
Yeah.
So underpinning democracy, as at least as it has been articulated in the post-colony in the Western states, has been supported by the idea of liberalism and the idea of capitalism. And so how do we then, if you are part of the excluded in a society, how do you then identify with a concept such as democracy, which clearly, has its own machinations and mechanisms of including and exclusion, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, a practical example, then we can say in South Africa, for example, we talk about post 1994, you know, as an all-inclusive event, you know. But now we can also say that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world, you know. So how do we reconcile that? How do we say, in one hand, that, you know, this is a concept that is all-inclusive, liberal democracy is all-inclusive, but at the same time, we can say that, you know, they are, you know, almost half, you know, the population, you know, that is not working.
Yeah.
You know, there's, you know, high levels of, you know, unemployment and inequality.
Yeah.
So for me, I mean, democracy, you know, shows that process of inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah.
You know, and it is also, I mean, a way of thinking that is, I think maybe, you know, I'm also just trying to think of the free market, the relationship between democracy and the free market, you know.
I think we're going to go to that just now. I want to, because that's a question that I also want to want you to kind of like expand on it a little later, on that relationship of liberal democracies or liberal democratic imaginations of freedom, and then the market freedom as constantly connected, these two freedoms. So I'm going to go to that, but I want you to finish this thought around, and I hate that we constantly segue back to South Africa, even though we're trying to speak with the rest of the continent in terms of the political imaginations. But I want here to think of Mpegi's thinking around the African-centered democracy. That there were thoughts around that in the 1994s and in the 2000s, and of course the African Renaissance and all of that. I mean, his projects that were kind of like thinking about these African-centered democracies. And I think this underpins the peer review mechanisms that he champions afterwards, the African Union and all of that. I mean, democracy, human rights, and social justice are all constitutive act of the African Union that emerges from this attempt to imagine an African-centered democracy. Even though they did something totally different afterwards. I don't know if you can talk to that. And
I mean, you know, not to... Mbeki is not the first person to sort of think about, you know, democracy in Africa in that sense. We can think of the Osakefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, you know, who really is one of the first Pan-Africanists, you know, to lead a successful revolution, you know, in the continent, you know, and his sort of thoughts around how do we sort of indigenize these Western concepts? How do we indigenize these Western institutions? You know, of course, you know, there were tragic failures, but at the same time, you know, those were our forethoughts, you know, when it comes to political theory in the continent, doing political theory and practice in the continent, but looking at those concepts and how we can sort of start indigenizing them. And therefore, for me, what I would say is that what Abu Thabo Mbeki were trying to do was inadequate in one sense. Of course, in one sense, you can say that, you know, the idea of African Renaissance was trying to center Africans, you know, African thought, African thinking, you know, African practices, you know, which is, I mean, applaudable. But at the same time, you can't introduce, I mean, also the concept of the Renaissance. Remember, when I was talking about the development of democracy itself, or the idea of democracy, the Renaissance is a European invention, you know? So, I mean, there's a tension there, you know, African Renaissance, you know? Those are concepts, not just words, you know? how do you reconcile those two concepts? You know, and I think Mbeki never told us, you know, how do you, are we trying to mirror something that looks like, an invention, a new wave, that, the Europeans also did in the 16th century, with this concept of a renaissance, or are you saying this is something that's completely new to Africa, but nonetheless you haven't explained, what
how it's going forward,
how it should go forward. So hence for me, I mean, and also not to be really unfair, I mean, African, as Africans, we've always been trying. I think since, the anti-colonial period, we've always been trying to whether decolonize our institutions, decolonize our knowledge, but at the same time, I think we have also been struggling to make sense of the tension, that we have with Western ideas and concepts. And I think that's the same thing that happened to Kwame Nkrumah as well, same thing that happened to Nyerere, same thing that happens in South Africa, same thing that happens, all over the continent. And not to be fair on the continent, but these are the same sort of issues that, they deal with in South America, same issues that they're dealing with in Asia, but what we can say, and I think, decoloniality scholars will then say, this is the coloniality of power. The Western knowledge system has, assimilated us in such a way that, in our attempt to, always trying to decolonize it, we forget that, we are within it, and it is as if being within it, we can't think of our own ways of being, So, I mean, the concept of African Renaissance, as Mbeki were trying to conceptualize it, has a long trajectory in the continent. I would say that.
I'm actually glad that you're pointing out the tension between African and Renaissance in Mbeki's project, because
he never tells us about, he never explicates it. I think what he does, he explains, the sort of project, of what African Renaissance means and what it should mean in the continent. But we are never given, a dissection, of both these concepts, as they exist. We are sort of, it is taken for granted that we are going to use these words as English words. They have meanings on their own. We shouldn't question them, to that extent. And maybe we'd say, the idea of Renaissance doesn't belong to, it's not owned by the Europeans. But I mean, then the question would be, can you show us an event, a practical event, that has been called a Renaissance, outside of, that problem space. So hence for me, it is important to explain these concepts, not to in fact undermine, but just to show how, then this would, work in practice, and how it would then inform, what it means to be African. In a way.
And I think also just before we move to the next point, what becomes also powerful, especially now, the kind of works that are coming out now that are tracing the idea that, I mean, democracy, all of these things that kind of like centers the whole lingua franca that kind of like animate democracy, whether it's human rights, social justice, they kind of like share intellectual histories with slavery, colonialism, and all of that. So that's an interesting one. But I think just to make a departure here, I think it is fair here to say that the critique of democracy doesn't suggest that it is not worth pursuing. I think it is still very much worth pursuing. particularly in thinking about the radical demands or the contestations of existing power structures, as we are seeing in Nepal last week, or in Kenya, the images that have been coming there, or when you're thinking about Mozambique recently or Botswana, in terms of how democracy allows for the kind of arranging ourselves around these radical contestations. And so I think the critique of democracy that I want us to make is not necessarily on the unrealized possibilities of democracy, but the realized one, which are the liberal democracies. And this is where then I want you to make the connection between liberal democracy or the liberal democratic freedom, the imagination of that together with the market freedom.
Yeah. I mean, we cannot think of liberal democracy outside of capitalism, is what I want to, I think, argue. Precisely because the idea of parliamentary democracy or liberalism has always been involved or in a relationship with the capitalist mode of production. What is a mode of production? It's basically a way in which you organize society economically, and who then organizes this society economically. It is the political status quo which has taken over, or which has functions under these guise of liberal democracy all over the world. Wherever there's a liberal democracy, there's capitalism, right underneath there. And hence, always and everyone in whatever state we talk about corruption, capitalism is not immune to corruption. In fact, capitalism is an enabler of corruption. So do we then think that the political elites or those who are running the state, can get away or can somehow escape the capitalist mode of production, can somehow escape corruption in a way? They can't. The system is built like that. It is within parliamentary democracy is built within, capitalism. You know what I'm saying? I think that's one way of looking at it. And if we are talking about liberalism as just like democracy, these two concepts and ways, they are so interchangeable that, we sometimes take them as natural. We cannot think, or we think of liberal democracy as the best form of democracy. What is another form of democracy? If we are not thinking of liberal democracy, what is another form of democracy? Can we talk about a
socialist democracy?
Socialist democracy. We know in the West, whenever you talk about anything that concerns socialism, and also in the continent and somewhere else, it is usually seen as, undemocratic. So you talk about socialist democracy, democratic and democratic democracy doesn't make sense. That's how the West have always, sort of understood and peddled the idea of democracy. So liberal democracy, especially in South Africa, which privileges the individual, we know that liberalism is part of the Enlightenment episteme, which centers the individual, man, and reasoning capacity. So what happens in places where, communalism is sort of the starting point of what it means to be in the world, then how do we then understand liberal democracy in that sense? What does liberal democracy do to those who understand themselves, as formed by society, as collectively informed or subjected to society in that sense, So I think this idea of liberal democracy has gotten away with a lot of, misinterpretations or lack of interpretations. It has been peddled with the idea of capitalism to such an extent that, today we take for granted the idea that what it means to be human is connected to the idea of democracy, is connected to the idea of liberalism, which is a very staunch form of individualism, which is connected to, there are other, other malices, such as consumerism,
Yeah.
These ideas are very much intertwined, and hence maybe that's why for someone like, for people in the for intellectuals in the black radical tradition, it is important to then, question, firstly, what it means to be human. Sylvia Wynter has done that, Fanon has done that, Sobukwe has done that, Biko has done that, we are doing that. Hugo recently,
yes,
with his book, has magnificently showed, that, these ideas that we take for granted, are in fact part of the reason why the status quo perpetuates its domination in society or in our lives, So hence you cannot, the idea of the free market itself, Samukelo, the idea of the free market is based on a capitalist understanding of the human, which is you are an economic agent that is rationally chasing to produce profits, in one way or the other, But why don't we question those concepts, And if we are to think then about resistance movements, as democratic, as trying to open up a space that has already been closed down by those who are ruling the status quo, is it profitable to continue to think about it as democratic? Perhaps it is, as it is articulated by the resistance movement, whether in Nepal, in Mozambique, you name all of these places, in Palestine, in Sudan, perhaps it becomes useful. But it doesn't have to be useful so that we are wanting to please those who are ruling the status quo, to say, I know we are democratic, then, our struggles are legitimate. The reason that we have been excluded, makes us question, firstly, this democratic dispensation. And it is fair, for us to think about new ways of opening up society and organizing ourselves in such a way that the distribution of resources, the distribution of knowledge, is extended to everyone.
Yeah.
Because that's what we are, against. There are people who have and there are people who do not have. So hence these concepts, I get frustrated when they are so, abstract without, the proper explanations. They must have proper explanations so that we can then, understand these resistance movements in a new light. How do you understand a struggle in Mozambique today? Because Mozambique is a democratic country, that's what Frelimo will say. This is a democratic country. We have regular elections, we vote, but they are not counting the exclusions, They are not counting how, from those who have been excluded, how they think of, how they practice democracy. It is as if, democracy from the resistance movement is not the real democracy. Democracy must always come through elections, and so on and so forth, and if not, then we know that you are not being democratic.
I'm going to come to the question of how the liberation movements have been regrouping lately. I mean, we saw the meeting of these liberation movements happening here in South Africa, whether it was, I think, the ZANU-PF or the ANC, the Frelimos, all of them are kind of like regrouping in this very contemporary moment of democratic contestations. But I think the question that I want to pose now is just to finish the thought that we had on liberal democracies, is what Francis Fukuyama's very famous book, The End of History, suggests in the early 90s as a signifier of the end of the Cold War. He comes up with this grand theory of how the liberal democracy is the last profound political imagination that humanity will ever experience. And in a way that kind of like puts liberal democracy as the only
alternative.
That this is the final solution for humanity. At last we have arrived. This is what the end of history is trying to tell us. But I want maybe to hear just shortly your thoughts around the impact of this on the conceptions of political freedom and political life globally.
I think what Fukuyama has done, or what he tried to do, was to close down any possibility of imagining political freedoms or political action outside of liberal democracy, outside of, Western thought, and I think it was, and if we, read his texts, we as a historian, of course, there's a lot of gaps in his history as well. But we know that any thought and text is subjected to a particular ideological position. So Fukuyama is not, Fukuyama is not free from that as well. Because what he was able to do, or what he has done, is to argue that, we cannot think alternatively outside of liberal democracy.
Yeah.
We cannot, and then, this gives credence to, before in fact that, we know that, his statements are backed by certain events that were happening, during the time of his writing, whether it's the fall of the Soviet Union, the post-colonial period, the opening up of China, Western Asia embracing the free market, system, and booming, at the very same time, but I think what it has done then, is to close down possibilities of imagining political freedom, and as a way of ridiculing, past, revolutionary movements, to say, they failed, this is the only ultimatum, that humanity is going to have. But as I've been saying, in the post-colony, we have seen, living under liberal democracy, the sort of detriment to the environment, the chasing of profit, the extraction, that happens, in our daily lives, the inequality that we see in the continent, in many continents, in our societies, the adoption of this, crass individualism, as a way of, what it means to succeed in the world, this is all peddled by liberal democracy. And it seems to me that, we haven't, had alternatives, to how then we are dealing with these sort of malices or oppressions, that we are seeing in this world that are caused by liberal democracy. Israel is a liberal democratic state, so what would Fukuyama say about that? Does that then justify the subjugation of the Palestinians? He
would call it contingencies.
Just contingencies. I guess, from those who are, part of, the 1% or part of the political elites. We are contingencies as well. But how do we then, as contingencies, think differently about organizing society politically? So hence I think Fukuyama statements, ideological in that they were supporting the liberal democratic dispensation, liberal democracy together with neoliberalism at the very same time, which has caused havoc, no thinking about the public good. If you think about the public good, you also have to think about a way of making profit, of extracting, the public good in order to make profit, whether it's, privatization of, state-owned enterprises, privatization of basic necessities and services. It is almost it's like the only way that we can think about in this current world, what it means to develop, to progress, to succeed. Hence even those concepts, development and progression, they have their own context. They should be unpacked. So Fukuyama statement is ideological in that sense. I think it closes down possibilities of imagining and expanding freedom in the world.
Speaking of imagining new freedoms, I'm thinking here of how liberal democracies is very much it functions with the fixed and bounded spaces,
sure.
and that is the nation state. That it has to be fixed, it has to be bounded, and all of that. And what we are seeing with these new not just contestations, but the new rethinkings where there's thinking around world democracies that have to go beyond the nation state, and what kind of new imaginations that can come out of that. I mean, the new political freedoms that have to go beyond the idea of the fixed and the bounded territory.
I think it's also important to really be patient in our analysis of our current contemporary crisis or problem of capital, of the nation state, of democracy itself, and one of the ways that I think we should do this is to reimagine what a revolution is, to reimagine the concept of a revolution, what it means and signifies for us today. And there's a scholar, scholars, Cora Diamond, Alistair McIntyre, the philosopher, and David Scott from the Caribbeans. And of course, there've been, people like Fanon, us in the Black radical tradition as well, who've thought about what does conceptual change mean. Cora Diamond has this concept that we can rethink concepts, the loss of concepts. The loss of concepts has consequences. The consequences can be the gaining of a new concept. But what do we mean by conceptual loss? By conceptual loss, we mean a concept, like revolution, for example, has lost its context, has lost its conditions of possibility, of emerging, has lost its life world, meaning that we cannot continue to articulate the concept of a revolution the way Frantz Fanon was conceptualizing a revolution, the way the Algerians were doing it, the way the communists were doing, the way the anti-colonial liberation movements were doing. And unfortunately, that is how we are seeing current political parties, that's what they're doing. Still taking us back to that imaginary. Now, what is different that we are going to build if we are still sticking to that imaginary? If that means that firstly, it means that we do not take seriously the failures of past revolutions. We don't take them seriously in that sense, in our analysis of the situation. Hence, the concept of a revolution that is bounded with the party itself, it's difficult to reimagine, a revolution outside of a political party. But does it have to? Do we always have to think of something that is called a revolution, tied to a political party, a party that is going to win the revolution and then, take over the state, then as a matter of fact, then adopt a liberal democracy, then, we know the story, So how do we then reimagine the new revolution? And one way I think of doing it, especially in our contemporary period, everywhere else in the world, is to think outside of the political party. Because the political party has been this organization, that has, masked itself as a beacon of freedom for people, for the people. It's going to represent you in parliament so that you can gain the freedoms necessary to gain, And it's not only in South Africa, it's all over the world.
Yeah.
It's important that we rethink this concept of the politics of the political party.
Yeah.
Can politics be subjective? Can we think of politics, as first and foremost as subjective? By subjective, I mean, what happens to you in the world? What affects you in the world? Can you begin from that point of view of a subjective politics that then, leads you to a collective politics? A collective politics that is not tied to, eyeing your, placing your eye on the state only as the ultimate prize, because once you seize the power of the state, many things can happen,
Yeah.
Can we then think of a different moral, political outlook, of our current conditions, of our current situation, that can then lead us to different practices and imaginings of freedom outside of the political party. I think that's one thesis. I think that I'm finding it should be relevant for the young people, should be relevant for anyone who's interested in transforming society, transforming people's life, transforming education, transforming gender roles in society, transforming, what it means to be in the world, to think outside of the political party, because, it has crept in society in such a way that we cannot independently think about how are we going to organize society. You are always thinking and looking at the state, So the dependency situation that liberal democracy with its allies, capitalism or neoliberalism, and this crass individualism, and of course, ultimately the state, has created the citizen as a dependable, as a dependent, It's difficult for us to, unless you have a lot of money. That's how we think of freedom.
Yeah.
You have to have a lot of money so that you can think outside of the state, so that you can be independent, as a human being.
Yeah.
We are seeing the effects of all of these things all over the world today. It's no wonder why, we have so many political catastrophes. It's no wonder why we have so many university dropouts. It's no wonder why we have, a few people amassing wealth, and we, without any question, it's no wonder why, everyone wants to have a piece of the pie, it's no wonder why, because we are all chasing, we are all fixated, by this idea, of liberal democracy and its, sources of individualism and so on and so forth, So it's important that we reimagine. So as Cora Diamond, David Scott would say, or Alistair McIntyre would say, whenever there's a conceptual loss, then, there's a conceptual gain. What are some of the concepts then, do we use, do we adopt to think about our own conditions, to think about what the world that we are trying to create, to think about the difficulties, of creating this world, and not to be naive, to think, everything is going to be all gloom and, all doom and glory, or, everything is going, there are struggles, that's why struggles happen, struggles are there for us to reflect, to analyze what we have done, where we come from, and what we can do, so it's important, at least for me, to think about our current condition in that sense, and maybe Samukelo, just the last part, and for me, then that's what it means that's what Black Islamic praxis then means, know. If we are saying we want to think of politics outside of the political party, as a way of reimagining revolutionary thought and revolutionary practice. For me, what Islam teaches me is that you have to change yourself first. Revolution happens subjectively first. You don't preach this, then you practice that. Yeah. Otherwise, then what is the point? Are you not then, following in the footsteps of, those leaders who were, who were militant, arguing and, fighting for, liberation. But when they are, in power, then something different happens. That happens across cultures, across states, and across history, as I'm saying. But if we, also hold on to the idea that it's important that you change yourself.
Yeah.
It's important that you reimagine yourself in this society, and not, as the university will say, not theoretically only, but practically as well. Can you practice, that change? And can you then mirror that change in such a way that that then combines with organization, because we need to organize, there's no, you don't need to organize masses of people, but you have to organize through ideas, through your practice of change. Then that's when, through your practices, you can then influence society.
That's a powerful way to end. I think that's really powerful. I think the ideas of thinking beyond political party is a kind of like a holder of political freedoms and all of these things. I think that's a very powerful way to end. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining this episode of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. Remember to like, to share, and to subscribe. Take care.